I don't want our thing to be taken into just shit talking
Yeah.
or being interpreted as just shit talking. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like on the Christianity thing, I've had significant amount of Bible study from a different context of, symbolism and things like that. There's a fascinating whole world of stuff with all that. So to your point about just shitting on everything that's Christian, right? I mean, I actually uh, did several years of study into prophecy and shit like that.
I thought we did a pretty good job last week or a couple days ago to like balance it. I
No, I
thought.
did
And
too.
yeah,
I
I
thought
mean,
I
it wasn't too bad.
just remembering to kind of like keep a certain kind of understanding and openness, even when something is fucking stupid.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
The big hormone Enneagram.
Let me lay it on the line. I got a little freakiness inside. Let you know that the man has got to deal with it.
Welcome to Big Hormone Enneagram. Last time we ended with talking about the instinctual drives, and David was tying them into the classical elements. And one of the things that I think is important to distinguish with the instincts and the Enneagram is that when we talk about instincts, there is on one hand the biological instinctual drives that we share with other forms of life. And then there are the instincts in the context of type. So a lot of times this confuses people that are new to the Enneagram, that there's a difference between talking about the drives as they are and as they're represented, um, across human beings and across other animals and how they impact us psychologically versus what happens when they become part of the type, which is when we become psychologically identified with the agendas and motivations of the instinctual drives. So, there's one thing to have a self preservation drive or to describe self preservation or qualities of self preservation. It's another thing to be a self preservation type. So, I am not a self preservation type, but Miss Nancy is. And
Yes.
Miss Nancy uh, was anxious about when we were starting tonight's recording because her sleep is extremely precious.
Hmm.
And so the energies around being a dominant self-pres or sexual or social, the quality of attention, what your attention is on, what your attention is aroused by, where it goes to, when it's tracking, the quality of what I call libidinal energy, like just like psychological energy, where that it's galvanized or not, depends on type. But there are ways of talking about the instinctual drives, independence of type, and how they play out in human beings, how they play out um, across cultures, and how they play out in terms of the imagery, symbolism, and archetypes they evoke, which is a lot of what falls under David's specialty.
Hmm.
And then also what you just said, trying to parse libidinal energy as maybe like the raw energy spark plug of all kinds of psychological and just energies in the body, right? But
Mhm.
that's sort of the fuel. How do you parse that libidinal energy? That's lighting up the whole circuit board, no matter your instinctual stacking. Parsing that from the sexual instinct, and then also parsing the fact that human beings are super social creatures from the social instinct, parsing those two apart. Yeah.
I felt like the instincts were the most confusing part of getting into the Enneagram for me. Well, because yeah, when I got into the Enneagram, it just seemed like there was no coherence whatsoever about what the instincts meant, especially around sexual and social. It for a long time, I'm talking like years, trying to make sense of the material available. And when you guys posted, I think it was you, John, that posted this in EIDB, the Russ's workshops.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was. So when that happened, it seemed like something new was happening because I hadn't seen anything like that.
Yeah.
Before, and the ideas were completely against all the stuff that was available. And I've always wondered, because you probably know more about the behind the scenes, like how big of a deal was that at that time? Did like in terms of the ripple effect, how did that come about that Russ took that up? A focus on the instincts in that way. And have you noticed a big change since then? That was like what, 8 years ago?
Probably
10 years?
longer. So good questions. I think Don and Russ had been working together on instinct stuff for a while, and I don't know who, set forth what, but basically, together they realized that the instinctual drives were actually instinctual drives, meaning that the name was not lying. That they actually described animal biology, and that in as Russ put it to me, the instincts were independent variables of type, meaning they could be seen as their own system. They weren't dependent variables, which is what the subtypes are, meaning uh, little like subdivisions of the type. The subdivisions, as we talked about the other day, are based in Naranjo seeing type and instinct as based on a Gurdjieffian schema of the subdivision of centers. And he saw it based on, this is according to Russ and who spoke with Naranjo. Naranjo was inspired by his mentor, a guy named Molina. I can't remember, is Armando or something, Molina. And so, in the scheme, in the Gurdjieff work, the body center is called the moving center because it's the center of our movement, and which is different than the instinctive center, which a lot of times in Enneagram teachings, instinctive center and body center are used interchangeably, but that's mixing up something.
And the instinctive center is the center that has the instincts.
I believe so. Gurdjieff didn't. Gurdjieff didn't specify it, but he said that the instinctive center could be divided into 3 centers, and that those 3 centers had a positive and negative polarity, so kind of like 6 altogether.
Okay.
But I take the positive negative polarity of, I take the instinctive center to be the instinctual drives, and the positive or negative can mean they can be co-opted by the personality and become a part of the personality's mechanism of identification.
Fixation.
Yeah, fixation, or they can be actually in service of the well-being of the body. And so in this Nicole excuse me, Maurice Nicole is one of the students of Gurdjieff who elaborated this system a little bit more, or this subdivision. And so, for example, I'll take the emotional center because I'm a feeling type. So in the emotional center, you could have they would divide it by the moving part of the emotional center, which is the body center part of the emotional center, the emotional part of the emotional center, and the intellectual part of the emotional center. And Naranjo, and I think there's something really to this, where he was looking at, okay, maybe then that means that type is based in these divisions of centers, which I think there's a lot of validity to this and a lot to uncover through this lens. So like, because a 2, for example, is an emotional type, but they scramble the emotional center and the body moving center. They have to act on their feelings. They could be considered the moving part of the emotional center. So that'd be 2. 3 is a little more complicated because people don't necessarily see 3 as super emotional, but they represent the struggle of the emotional center in general. They'd be the emotional part of the emotional center. And according to the scheme, 4, they use the mental center to stimulate or to reinforce the identification of the emotional center. So as the 4, I would be representing the intellectual part of the emotional center. And it goes on like this. And then it'd be an interesting question to sort of pick this apart. Like, would the moving part of the intellectual center be the 7, right?
Yeah.
Probably.
Mhm.
Anyway,
Yeah.
then in addition to this division, Naranjo saw the instincts as correlating with each center. So he saw, for some reason, and I get, like we talked about before, there's a little bit intuitive thing that makes sense, but I don't think it works. He saw in self-preservation as correlating with the body center. He saw sexual as correlating with the emotional center, and social correlating with the intellectual center. And again, there is something to it, but it's only vague.
Mhm.
And so I identify as a sexual 4. So I'd be considered the emotional part of the intellectual part of the emotional center.
Mhm.
And that's that identifying sexual with emotional is why people mistakenly believe sexual is one-on-one intimacy.
Mm.
There's also the qualities that we associate to the heart that are similar to qualities that we associate with sort of libidinal sexual excitation and energy. For example, cold-hearted, warm-hearted, and then with sexuality, someone's hot or someone's frigid, right? So there's a tangle that happens there, I think, is another reason why there's maybe an intuitive connection between them, although maybe ultimately we'd say it's incorrect, but it's maybe one reason why there's somewhat of a natural tangle that happens conceptually.
And even
Anyway.
culturally speaking, there's a lot of conflation between emotion and sexuality.
Right.
And that a lot of time, like Gurdjieff was very clear. He said that the sex center, meaning the genital. So to back up, Gurdjieff described 7 centers. There's the 3 basic centers: the body, the heart, and the mind. In addition, there are 2 higher centers: the higher intellectual center and the higher emotional center. And then in the body, the moving center, he said, also features the instinctive center and the sex center.
Mm-hmm.
And the sex center is not the sexual drive; it's the reproductive organs. And Gurdjieff was very clear that the sex center should have sex, meaning while it's perfectly fine and natural and normal and wonderful to bring emotion into sexuality, don't confuse the two, and don't use sexuality as a way to resolve emotional stuff. Likewise, this is actually really funny. Gurdjieff was very against masturbation, surprisingly, because
Really?
it was really weird.
Strange.
He should have definitely masturbated more because he had a lot of kids with a lot of different women. But he
Get his rocks off.
he
Shoot
called
your shot.
masturbation the war of 5 against 1, which is pretty funny.
What?
Which means
What is happening?
5 fingers.
Oh my god. Wow. All
pretty
right, that's a very male view on it. God, fuck him.
And
women use 2 hands, in other words.
And he's using a war
All the time.
metaphor as an 8.
Yeah, as an 8.
Jeez.
But he was, the reason I think he was against masturbation was not because self-pleasing is bad, but because he was worried, I think, about people using the mental center to stimulate the sex center.
Detangling the centers.
Exactly. He was all, inner work is about detangling the centers. And so how do you, how do we conflate the centers on all different levels? And, a major way we fall asleep with the sex center is using fantasy or emotion to stimulate the sex center rather than the sex
Mhm.
center stimulating the sex center.
So can you unpack that? What does that mean? That, for example, how would you use the intellectual center? Is it just like fantasizing about, let's say you're fantasizing
Pictures.
about a previous sexual act that is like through the imagery of that act? Is that using the intellectual center to turn yourself on?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm not, just interpreting Gurdjieff is one thing. I think that there's a certain level where that's harmless and normal and natural, and because we don't compartmentalize our mind from our bodies and all this kind of stuff. But I think he was really trying to speak against how much we unconsciously scramble the centers.
Hmm.
Our types are based in the ways that our centers do their wrong work.
Mhm.
And the whole ego is based on the way we do our wrong work. And so one of the ways that the ego is reinforced through sexuality is through the wrong work of centers. So um it's not so much about adopting like a rigid self-control over oneself, but becoming aware of like how do we turn ourselves on. And in the realm of sexuality, what's challenging is that our culture, we generally aim towards long-term monogamous relationships, and human beings prior to agriculture, so say anthropologists, were not in monogamous relationships for very long. So there was a lot of free shared sexuality. So the issue of needing to kind of revitalize a monogamous sexual relationship that didn't have fire wasn't as much of an issue.
Mhm.
Right. So scrambling these centers wasn't an issue as much in that sense.
Exactly right.
Yeah, I will say that when this is semi on topic, when you did a breathwork session with me, like a short breathwork session, um, when I came out of it, I was actually using my eyes to see,
Mm,
which sounds like dumb,
no.
but I mean, like everything was so bright and so colorful. It was
Mm.
like painful, and things were like moving that shouldn't have been moving,
Hmm.
and it was just crazy. It blew my mind. It was like going on for hours, and you were like, "Yeah, you're using your eyes to see instead of everything else,"
Well,
and it
what?
was
Right.
Yeah.
awesome.
What is the everything else? What's the opposite of using your eyes to see? What were you doing before? How would
Well,
you?
that's a great question. I don't know what I do on an average day-to-day basis. I just know that it was different for those few hours after the breathwork session. I've only done one, so I really can't.
Well, is one way to say it? I mean, is it relate to the image triad heart center thing of sort of looking at mirrors and looking for mirrors instead of looking or something? Or does that make any sense? Do you know what I mean? Like,
I've never heard of that, but
I,
it sounds familiar. Like I understand what you're saying, but I've never heard any of you talk about that.
Well, I would imagine it's like, because they explain in some kind of psychological things that what you're seeing, that you're filling in the gap in what you're seeing a lot of
Hmm.
times.
Yeah.
uh, and so
mm,
I would imagine that when you get really
mm,
present to what that sense, what you're really receiving from that sense, you're not doing that. And so it's like a crystal clear, um, like when people lose their other senses, that everything gets put
mm.
into that one um, sense, and so it gets really sharp
Hmm.
because they're not filling in the gaps with other
I,
other modes of perception.
I could imagine a beingness of seeing being maybe related also to sort of things being wiped of their labels and just being what they are. I don't know if that means anything.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Oh,
that has a lot to do with it.
yeah, I think definitely that's a part of it. And so an interesting future topic potentially that's very complicated is the ray of creation or higher worlds, but that's a whole thing. But just in terms of I think everything y'all are speaking to is accurate. That that on one hand, when we see, generally there is a part of our brain that is a filing cabinet that is just sort of going, okay, like I see book, desk, computer, whatever, and I'm just sort of, it's like everything becomes appropriated by previous memories of objects and situations that I have, and very rarely do we encounter a novel situation that's truly novel in the sense of inviting us to see something that isn't already sort of stored in our psyche, that
Mhm.
not an object relation or something like that. um and there's an emotional component, there is a mental component, and there's a physical component, like the body taking things to be objects. But also in terms of our levels of presence, when we're not when we're just in our average state, we're not really present to our experience, and so it's this mechanism of imposing associations over our experience, and we're not really seeing, we're sort of gesturing towards seeing. But then when we start to become present, uh it's the difference between, like, the word I like to use is noticing, where we're noticing what's in front of us rather than just receiving it passively.
That sounds like it's a new thing every time, right?
Mhm.
It's
Yeah,
yeah.
there is something new to discover because it's in the moment.
Mhm.
When you're just passively seeing, you're not discovering because you're just sort of filling in the blanks or labeling, like book, that's another book, that's a drawing, that's a, what
Mhm.
statue, whatever. You're not really encountering it. To notice something means some part of you is actually meeting the present experience, and it's getting past the psychological shorthand.
Hmm.
Boom.
And it has a quality of vibrancy that's unusual for our normal state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which sounds like what Nancy might have experienced.
Right.
Yeah. And after kind of learning breath work and how to at least get myself somewhat present in my body, which I'm still totally working on, not a pro at. Um, I've used it in situations where I'm in like pain to kind of check in and see, because this is kind of where my self pres will kick in and take over. If I'm in discomfort or pain, I will just, no matter how what level the pain is at, I will be like, I can't do anything. I will shut down.
Yeah.
And that's how like instincts kind of tend to work. So I've been using breathing to check in and see, okay, what level is this pain actually at? Because I don't actually know. And sometimes I'll check in and it's not even pain. It's something completely different. It's just my brain saying, okay, there's something here and it's now bad. Okay, pain. So it's interesting how a lack of presence can kind of just relabel something to be completely different than it is.
So when it's not actually pain, what are you experiencing?
Sometimes it'll just be like pressure or like shifting in energy or just like movement in the body.
Like just an
Um,
unusual state for the body to be in?
yeah, like just a twinge or a muscle twitch or like whatever it is, just different than the average state of being.
Hmm.
And even if it is legit pain, it becomes less when I become present.
So how does your relationship to the pain shift when you're more present?
It's not a full body experience. It's a very localized experience.
Hmm. So
So
you're
it
you're you're,
doesn't, yeah, it
you're
doesn't take me over.
you're like less identified with it.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, the conscious breathing helps to create some kind of it helps you be more present, for one thing, because I mean just the effort to be conscious of a normally unconscious process brings you into presence, but also the nervous system calms down a bit. And when the nervous system is calmer, your sort of inner perception of yourself and your state is much clearer. And so, yeah, it's like whether it's pain, physical pain, or any other kind of distress, when we breathe consciously with it, generally the emotional extra whatever, the little twists that we put to our physical states lessens, and we can actually uh, be with it respond more appropriately, intelligently to it, and not react so strongly, and not let it pollute the whole sense of our awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm thinking about sexual pain. What is that?
Ooh, that's something fun to play with.
Yeah, it seems self-pres is so easy to sort of map out because I mean it's in your body.
Yeah.
Um, I
You
was
talking
talking,
like heartache or like
well, just like what, just trying to pinpoint for me, how do I, in the style of my type, react to
Pain relative to
sex,
the sexual instinct. you mean?
right? Like stress related to that.
Oh, I
Is
totally
that
thought you meant masochism.
it could be that too.
Sadism.
Damn it. Continue.
You made it really
we all know who
concrete.
the real freak on this call is.
I was like, whips, chains, let's go.
I'm talking about real pain, Nancy.
Fuck that.
I'm talking about being ignored by the person I'm interested in.
The only thing that matters.
Oh man.
Well, just like thinking about it is because it's real easy to relate to or to explain what self-pres stress or pain is like on a moment, hourly, daily basis, but it's not as easy to explain what that is for sexual, because it is like the personality is reacting to the need to be alluring and interesting, and to find something to charge yourself up with, and so I think for me, I think what I've noticed in like trying to meditate and noticing that my personality is always needing to like have to find the next kind of um I have to find the next thing that can, I don't know, like charge things up. Like it's always a need of there's has to be something that I can jump into, like a thing that can be really interesting and can really open things up or completely turn everything upside down, even if it's just for like uh I don't know, it feels like there's can always this feeling of emptiness that if I'm not doing that, if I'm not creating something that feels like I'm going into a new place that I've never been to before, that's completely interesting to me, and this is going to be a mind-blowing experience. If I'm not doing that, it's like I'm not alive. I'm not living, and it's just the worst feeling. And I'm not really conscious of this, and so I tend to cover it up with a lot of activity or just doing things, and I'm not realizing that I'm I'm feeling this sort of stress of not having anything. Does that make sense, John?
Yeah, what you're speaking to is there's sort of two aspects. When it comes to our instinct, no matter what our dominant instinct is, there's on one hand, yeah, like the physical sensation and physical pains and stuff like this. But even for self-preservation, there's like the longing to feel home.
Yeah.
Like that sense of one's like real home, or that real sense of like rest or being held. uh like a lot of self-preses will have like comfort food and that kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like the emotional sense of well-being that's tied into that. It's not so much the food itself, because it might even be junk food, but it's that sense of nourishment and holding, and that's a holdover from when we were babies, and like our first experience of contact and love came through breastfeeding. It came through being held, and it came through feeling regulated.
Yeah.
And so all the instincts are about different kinds of regulation, and because they're about different kinds of regulation, they're all unconsciously tied to our infancy and mom. And the experience when we were infants is that we didn't have a personality yet, and so it's associated with love, and it's associated with essence.
Mm.
And so no matter what our instinctual drive is, we unconsciously think we're going to get the essence quality of our type through our instincts. And so it feels not just like life or death. It feels like like God turning its back on us
Yeah.
when we don't get it. So, for the eight, sexual eight, I'm longing for that sense of, that power and vitality and bigness and boom of the moment, like more present.
Yeah.
As Nancy's speaking to, it's like the present moment is actually very alive, and it's our personality that makes it very dead. And that quality of just being present is what the eight's heart really feels as their home. And so through the lens of type, it's like, oh, I associate the last experience I had with that quality with this certain part of my instinctual development in infancy. For a sexual type, it's going to be, oh, through a rapprochement, conflict, and all that kind of stuff. And so, when I was when as a little kid, after you start to separate psychologically and physically from your mother, there's this period of expansiveness. It's very self-pres expansiveness of like the little kid. It's called primary narcissism, but it's not really narcissism. But it's like, the kid feels like they're running around on the playground or something, and they bump their head, and they look at mom, and if mom doesn't get upset, then they're like, okay, I'm fine. Then they get up again, and they're very robust, and they like just learn to walk and explore the world. And then there's a point where the little kid realizes, I'm vulnerable and I'm little, and I want to go back to the merge state that I was in, that I just separated from. So libidinal energy gets focused back on mom, and the idea unconsciously is, I'm going to penetrate her boundaries and surrender my boundaries so I can get back to the merge state. But at this point in the kid's development, the kid is too old to really do that. And the mom probably doesn't want that either, because she's now appreciating that she's free from having to take care of an infant all the time. So a lot of times people mistake the sexual drive as a drive to merge. And there is the drive to merge because it's the drive to surrender and penetrate boundaries. But, in terms of this period of psychological development, the reason the little kid separated psychologically from mom in the first place was because he or she was getting overwhelmed by all the unconscious stress in their mother's nervous system, because little kids are like sponges. And that's what that need to discharge that stress is what caused them to actually separate psychologically from mom. So at this point, when they want to re-establish merging, that affect, all that stress is still there. So in the sexual drive in adults, there's the coupling of the drive to merge, followed by the drive to separate again. It's like that drive to like hook up or something, and then the next morning it's like, oh, okay, I gotta go, you gotta go, like a kind of awkward separation. And with sexual types, it's not a romance drive. It's like it might have romantic associations, but it's really about surrendering boundaries and then bringing them back up again, because I have to shield myself from that overwhelm. And so, that's kind of the constant tension. It's not a monogamy drive. But what's going on there too is that I'm not just reestablishing merging because merging is nice. It's because unconsciously this merged state is the experience of essence. So for the 8, it's like, I'm going to experience through this chemistry, through this big event, I'm going to experience that aliveness that feels like it's part of my being. And then when the person doesn't reciprocate, or they lose interest in me, or they don't choose me, the kind of pain I feel is the pain of rejection from my origin, basically.
Huh. I was more trying to figure out, like, how does that play out on a day-to-day basis? Because I'm not in contact with someone I'm interested in very often. So it's not like, but it's still kind of something that I have to deal with, the sense that there's nothing happening right now. And it's not necessarily that I want to be talking to someone that I'm interested in, but it can be just in the fact of, um, just like I'm having a normal day and I just feel like there's nothing happening, and I end up having to create this sense of aliveness, in being able to feel like I'm losing myself into something.
Exactly.
And it could be like, I don't know, something creative, or um, getting attention in a group chat, or creating like some drama on a thread, just that kind of shit, like get something going.
Well, it's not to say there's anything wrong with any of that stuff, but it's that need to like quote make something happen
Yeah.
unquote. That's that feeling of like I'm not actually experiencing the aliveness that I need.
Yeah.
I have to generate it, and that's the whole personality. Whatever our type is generating whatever that quality is for the 8. It's like I got to generate that aliveness and power and vitality. And one of the ways I do that is through pushing and expanding and kind of throwing my weight around and provoking and so yeah, it's like the product, the status of the ego is that alienation from what we want, but it's primarily going to happen through the sexual lens if that's our dominant instinct.
Mm-hmm.
It's like with
Whereas,
social aid, it's like I need to be the galvanizing force of my social milieu because it's like that's how something feels like it's happening.
which goes back to
You're
that
saying,
we
David?
could, which goes back to we could be, Emeka could be feeling the vibrancy of just what is right in front of him, essentially, in an ideal state. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that right? As
Yeah.
opposed to the personality trying to create it, right? It's already there. In other words,
Exactly.
yeah,
like what Nancy was speaking to.
right.
Having the eyes to see that. And so inner work is developing the capacities and the being that can actually be in contact with the moment and not be so weak as to be overridden by these programs that we default to.
Good luck.
So I guess being present would be like not feeling like the present moment is so dead because because if I'm not present to it, then I'm not. It is like a dull experience.
It's all an
and
illusion.
I do have to provoke something.
The personality
Yeah.
is an illusion. Yeah. So, or the lens of
The personality is dense. It's dense, so that quality of aliveness gets deadened through the density.
Mhm.
So being present is not eliminating the feeling that reality is not the way you want it to be or what you're looking for. It's being present with the disappointment and the reaction to that feeling like it's not in that, not as it should be, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that can be the doorway to recovering the in the moment experience of that kind of vibrancy. So presence is never rejecting anything. And that's one of the challenging things about presence is that we think, oh man, I fucking hate this person and I hate myself and I want to fucking do all this shit and blah, blah, blah. I better be in a more positive state. And presence is neutral, but it's including all that shit. That's why we were talking about last time with some of the cultural facets of Christianity that encourage a certain way of being that often invite repressing all the shit going on in the personality. Because if you can't actually be present with what's going on independently of your will, independently of your intention, just happening in the personality, then you can't be present. So, like, speaking to 4s being sort of sourpuss bitches and all this kind of stuff. I'm a 4, by the way. Just in case anybody gets upset. It's like it doesn't do any good to make ourselves in a better mood, but we can see and experience to be present with our mood and also be present with what's beyond just our mood. And that actually makes a more holistic perspective rather than changing one state, because that's just moving the pieces of the personality puzzle around and not actually changing your degree of being. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's all a great reminder for me. In the narrative classes, all we did was be present, like all the time, which is exhausting. So yeah, this is a great reminder because when you come back from that kind of state, it's really easy to just kind of hermit crab back into lack of presence or what you believe
Totally.
to be presence.
To circle back around to what I was wondering about back then, John, when you posted or when you went to, did you go to that workshop to to that Russ workshop, or did you just get the notes?
Yeah, I was there.
Okay. So like what kind of a impact was that at the time? Like based on what people were thinking the instincts were. Well, because to me it seemed like a really big deal, but I don't know if it actually made any difference back then.
Well, when it comes to in-person Enneagram events, the Enneagram is so powerful that generally most people that come away from any decently run Enneagram event, um, experience some degree of transformation or getting outside of their habit. So it always feels like a big deal.
Hmm.
But sometimes it's hard to piece what specifically was the big deal, or what led to the big deal. So
Yeah.
I think people appreciated and recognized that it was a thing that was important and new, but at the same time, in my view, there was still more to develop, and I think that Russ would agree with that as well, because that was probably 10 years ago or something.
Yeah. About 10 years
Um,
ago.
and so there's always more to learn and develop, and so it was it was a really great workshop, but I think that some people, like, I think the same way that some people really immediately take to the Enneagram and some people like, this is okay. Is it there's sometimes there's immediate recognition of like, whoa, the implications of this are like
Yeah.
huge. And some people don't see it that way. And I think that part of the struggle with any kind of new material is that people get very attached to and comfortable with old material
Mm,
and have a hard time discarding or seeing what's worth leaving behind of old material and keeping and integrating with new material. And so, some of the reactions that we'll get from posting just material online that is new or challenging to what's generally accepted is labeled sometimes as being really nefarious or something.
right.
Uh, Simply, I think, because people get so attached to certain outlooks, and there's an emotional investment in the mental. This is we're talking about scrambling the sexual center earlier. Scrambling emotion and intellectual center is getting emotionally attached to certain perspectives. And part of the awake in intellectual center or mental center is being able to discard a perspective as soon as it is not useful or accurate or doesn't illuminate something.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how people, because I mean the Enneagram is kind of like I mean when you first get into it, you don't know that much about it, and but it's interesting to see that people quickly attach to well-known teachers. And maybe this is because I'm social less and I didn't really care about that, but people are like look up who are the established texts, and without knowing very much about the Enneagram, maybe a year into it, they're defending those established, like Naranjo and whatever authors that have only existed for a couple decades, and they're defending those interpretations and those texts like so passionately.
Hmm.
It doesn't make any sense. Like you just got into this thing, you barely know who these people are, and but because that authority is there, it's like, well, we have to respect this. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, I studied philosophy in college,
Yeah.
and part of philosophy is the inquiry of challenging even those you respect the most.
Hmm.
And that I think there's different levels of thinking, but like most people understand memorizing categories as thinking with the Enneagram, right? Like, oh, the basic fear and the basic blah 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 of this type is this. And but I think every facet of understanding needs to be scrutinized and needs to come through a kind of an inner battle with the material, so that you've internalized it, that it's not just you memorized a lot of facets or descriptions or anything. And so like every teacher has done their very best to contribute something of real understanding, and has done their best to try to illuminate something, and some more successful than others. And I don't think anybody, well, not everybody, goes into the Enneagram insincerely. uh I think most teachers are really trying to be sincere, and I know a lot of them, and they're all really great, and they've all illuminated something. And no matter who it is, us included, there's always so much more to learn and discover.
Yep.
And there's some stuff that's bullshit, and we can be wrong, and there's some stuff that we might be right. But it's about having the background to discern the difference and the sincerity of our own inquiry to be able to admit when we're off.
Yep.
And to love what's real and true more than we love impressing people with our ideas. And sometimes that gets really lost because an idea gets challenged or something, and it's not necessarily the teacher usually, I think, that people are invested in. It's that, oh, this concept makes me feel a certain way, like I feel validated, or I feel seen, or I feel this illuminates something. And then the feeling gets undermined when the concept is challenged, and then it's like the only way to respond to that is you're an asshole.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
David, what was your perspective back then? Back in the day,
When he was like 60.
when all this shit came around and the new, it seemed like at least for me when I was reading the forums back then, it seemed like a pretty big deal to me. And I was just wondering if you saw it that way, and was there some kind of ripple effects on the forums, and did you see people's perspectives on the instincts changing, or what was that like on your point of view?
There was a lot of the way I describe it on that old Riso Hudson discussion board was a lot of work got done there.
Okay.
There was a whole lot of not work. I mean,
Yeah.
95% maybe not work, but and
as any good forum should be.
yeah, and I was part of the troublemaking. But yeah, no, there were a few people that were incredibly serious, insightful, interesting minds, and intuitive also. And it would happen sometimes that a new person would join, and you could tell that that person knew which small set of few people had the interesting sort of cutting edge thing, and not just and that not being about being whatever cool and interesting, but actually getting at something that was true, that had resonance. So you would watch certain people, and certain people would connect, and I really think some things happen there that, I don't know if this is an exaggeration, but I think didn't happen anywhere else in the world relative to the conversation about the instincts.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and there was one woman that, for example, besides what we've been referencing here, this bit about those notes from one of those seminars or whatever you call it that Russ did. There was one woman that had these occasional really insightful and condensed insights into especially the stackings. And I've shown you guys, for example, that there was one woman that wrote about the writing styles of each of the instinctual stackings, right? The 6 different stackings. And it's just about 3 or 4 sentences for each instinctual stacking, and it's was written to convey the tone of each of the stackings. And even though it's about writing styles of fiction authors, you can use that. Those were seeds to me that conveyed, you know, the stackings as very separate kinds of energies, you know, archetypal, tonal creatures or whatever, you know, that
Yeah.
that light up where whatever person and personality type they're set into, or you know, or comes from them, or if you want to think of the stacking sort of being the root system, and then the Enneagram type is actually somewhat secondary, a response to or a management system for the stacking. Um, so yeah, there was a lot of
Do you,
important stuff that happened there, and John, were you about to say something?
yeah, do you know what happened to her? Because I met her actually in person.
Mm-hmm.
Went by VO, right?
Yes.
And I met her on the same trip I met Ilaria on.
Oh, I didn't realize
Wow.
that was the same trip.
Yeah, I met her in Milan,
Mm-hmm.
and definitely a 5.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, kind of a character, but I never heard from her again.
Yeah, she was definitely veiled. Um,
Oh, that was the veiled one.
yeah.
Nice.
She's
Yeah,
great.
she's great, and we had a sort of almost we played around with a sort of adversarial relationship to some degree, because I went in there all cocky. I was going to be the counterphobic 9 or something, and make a bunch of noise and not be invisible, right? I was going to be I was kind of experimenting on that board with non-9ness, but of course it all comes out 9 somehow anyway. But anyway, um, but yeah, that was it was her, and there was a few other people, and there were some interesting conflicts that turned into things. I don't know. I mean, that, you know, some of those, that gets in too deep into, you know, all kinds of talking about specific people that
Yeah.
our audience here is not going to know about. But overall, yeah, there was well, the other thing that happened just briefly is that another woman, separate other person who's happens to be a 5, also mentioned something one day about this Buddhist symbol called the Bhavacakra, which we touched on in one or two of the earlier conversations here. And she mentioned the hungry ghosts, and for some reason I immediately just clasped onto that, and then and I thought for some reason that had something to do with either sexual self-pres or self-pres sexual instinctual stacking. And
Hmm.
then when I looked at the actual symbol, and it has these 6 segments in it, when I realized that there were 6 of them, just as there are 6 instinctual stackings, I said, "Oh, it's going to be the stackings. I know it right now." Like before I even started, and then it was,
Wow.
and so it was, and uh, and that was pretty amazing, for that whole that, and that's led to, I've been sort of on that journey with that symbol for about 7 years or so. And, you know, I'd been on and off toying with writing, and I've got, you know, about 350 pages of notes for a book. But I'm kind of glad, you know, that I didn't do anything sooner as far as putting out something, because I would probably just want to pitch the whole thing. It's because this is so critical what's come up with all of that, and the correlations are pretty amazing. Those are long conversations, but so that was another thing that happened there, that was rather tectonic, you know, plate shift underneath me about the Enneagram and so on.
David, do you know much about the history of the Baba Chakra?
I've read some of the history, but where were you going to go with that?
Well, so on one hand, there could just be a way that symbols are speaking to each other, that have no conscious basis or relationship, or the psyche, produces this symbol based on the experience of stackings without there being any conscious,
Yes.
you know, uh, just it becomes an intuitive expression of something that is a huge facet of human personality and experience, but that there's not a lot of language for.
Yes.
And on the other hand, and that may be so. On the other hand, I recently, I've been a major focus of mine through my studies of Egypt and Gurdjieff has been the history of the Enneagram, and not just the Enneagram, but the whole Western spiritual milieu and understanding going back to Egypt. And but I recently, I don't know much about Eastern spirituality, but there's some crossover with some Sufi things and some Tibetan things, especially Northern Sufism. But I have found this symbol called the Kala Chakra, and tried it. I don't know too much about it, and I got a book on it and blah blah blah. And I'm wondering, like it seems intuitively like it may be almost like an enneagrammatic Bhavacakra,
Mm-hmm.
and it means the wheel of time. And I know very like even reading about it, it's not really yet where in the book I'm looking at. It's not really about what this thing is, but sort of setting up the milieu and the understanding. But anyway, it'd be interesting to see if there is any kind of relationship there.
You had mentioned it to me, and I did a light touch into it for a little bit one day, but yeah, we need to maybe talk about it some more, or you might show me what you're looking at.
Yeah, I just have a book called The Wheel of Time, the Kala Chakra in context, but it started to pop up. It's like I was at my Gurdjieff teacher's place, and uh he just got a new bookshelf of like a bunch of like I guess he just had his stuff in storage or something, and immediately my eye goes to the Kala Chakra. There's a book on the Kala Chakra, and it's just started to pop up places. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. What is it about it? Can you say briefly that's making you think it pings into the Enneagram? Does it have
So
a nineism or something, or?
yeah, I believe it's actually a tenism of 10 worlds, but I think the first and the last world are sort of one and the same, like alpha omega kind of thing. But so I, let's see how to not drag this shit out. So there are different facets of the Enneagram when you're talking about Enneagram history. There's the symbol, there is the understanding of types, and then at certain points, like in Kabbalah and in I believe in an Egyptian system, there is a blending or marriage of the types and a system of worlds of different degrees of consciousness that shows up in Gurdjieff's Ray of Creation, but it's separate from the Enneagram. And so I believe that the Enneagram uh, of type and the Enneagram of worlds may have been one system, and the relationship of the symbol to those worlds and types may have come later. But I think it's super ancient, and I think it's one of the most powerful symbols or schemas in human history. And it's so full of meaning. And I think that the Kala Chakra is maybe an Eastern version of this same system.
Do you have any sense of, does it mention the Bhava Chakra and what you're looking at?
Not thus far. Like my study of it thus far is pretty superficial. And a lot of the ways that I've studied a little bit of Tibetan Buddhism, the way that it is laid out is different than Western systems, where Western systems, it's like human beings are asleep, and this is how you work with it. This kind of a thing. It's sort of didactic, whereas Eastern stuff is a little bit more like impressionistic and less specific. And so it's not laying things out quite as like sequentially and concretely. So like I don't know. It's hard for me to encapsulate in words and language, but it hasn't been so Western yet, and so
Right.
I'm trying to. I gotta do some more digging.
Does what are its origins relative to Buddha? Is it coming from?
Supposedly,
Okay.
but a lot of times, so Buddha was a lot more esoteric than people generally understand.
Mhm.
But and they say that the Buddha taught this, but sometimes when they say that, it doesn't mean the Buddha literally taught it like when he was alive.
Mm.
Like sometimes it means there was some kind of impression, inspiration from on high or from meditating on the Buddha. So I think the Buddha actually did teach this, but don't really know.
That's
yet.
what's said to be the case with the Bhavacakra symbol, is that Buddha himself designed it, did that, generated that map, if you will, that symbol.
Yeah, I think that's the same case here with the Kala chakra.
And Buddhism, generally is described as a psychological religion, if you will, right? It's not really a
Right.
religion. It's more a philosophy or
And
worldview or
discipline.
something. Right. So it's interesting that, and I should say briefly, I'm mapping the instincts and the instinctual stackings to the Bhava Chakra, but ostensibly, there's no mention of the instincts in the original texts. I'm making that leap, but it makes some sense because just at a basic level, that how we understand the instincts as being sort of prime drivers of our psychology, and the deepest, most powerful traps that we get into uh, are stemming from our identification with the instincts. So it makes sense, given all of that the association could be there hidden, so to speak, just waiting for me to come reveal it.
You
Or
and only
David.
you.
David Gray only.
the nine god.
Yeah, see?
Hey Nancy, when you were typing it for, were you typing as a sexual for?
I thought that I was sexual dominant. Yeah.
Okay. And how
Mhm.
did you was it us, or did you have any previous experience that made you think different,
We
or
did the
what?
collage thing with her. I
Oh, that's
think.
right. Okay.
Yeah, but I didn't really fully believe the collage, to be honest with you.
Nobody ever does at
Yeah,
first.
I know. It just seems too simple. But I didn't really understand the instincts for a long time until it was actually you, Emika, that pointed out the tea thing at the
Oh
restaurant.
yeah.
Oh shit! Like,
Yeah.
What's this?
oh,
Spill that tea.
lol. We were sitting at like dinner or something, and this was at one of the conferences, and I asked for hot green tea, and they brought it out in a French press, and I was sitting beside Emika, and I looked at him, and I was like, oh, I love that they bring it out in a French press, because there's nothing worse than oversteeped green tea. And he was like, yeah, you're a self-press.
Ding, ding,
I was
ding.
like, oh,
Ding,
okay,
ding,
I
ding.
get it.
There's nothing worse.
Yeah.
There's truly nothing worse. It's bitter. It's just pointless.
Worse
You
than
might
your
as
lover
throw it
leaving
away.
you. All of
Oh,
that.
I'd rather have genocide than
heartbreak.
Yeah.
She was so passionate about it, and I was like, "We're talking about tea."
Dude, tea is life.
That's it. There it is.
Yeah.
There it is.
I think, John, you once described a self-pres person having like a sensual relationship with things. And
Mhm.
I was like, yep. Like
Fine.
I love bed. Like it's my boyfriend. Like, yeah.
So y'all know so for for anybody listening, I often teach with my friend Julie Harris, workshops and classes and stuff like this through New York Enneagram and
.com.
.com. And so one of the things that she came up with, actually, like, she's pretty brilliant at practices, and we do this meditation, like a visualization meditation, on basically instinctual resources. And so we'll like go through this thing where we get everybody to like sense their bodies and to chill and to be breathing. And we start with have everybody close their eyes and kind of be blank for a minute, and then we have them imagine or visualize something that, like, their bed, or a food they really like, or some kind of self-pres object. And Julie is much better at I am than getting all the self-pres stuff, because she's self-pres, but sensing like the way your body actually physiologically responds to these things, and then from there, we drop that, and then we go into, all right, imagine somebody that you have a real strong crush on, that you find very attractive or sexy, this kind of a thing. And then, drop that, and then imagine like greeting your friend at the airport, like seeing somebody you really care about, being, this kind of a thing. And the physiological response and excitation is really revealing about, and specificity about, type and instinct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how specific you could get in describing each of those things would indicate.
And even noticing like, oh, like the green tea, like, oh, I'm like, I love my bed, like I like my bed, but I don't have that kind of feeling about it. I'm like,
It was how specific she was.
Specific.
It wasn't like, oh, I
And, like-
love green tea. It was like, it has to be this way and this way and this way. And I was like, I don't even know why you're still talking about tea.
Well, like-
specific and immersed. Immersed.
immersed.
Yeah.
David, like, what's a self-pres thing that you just love?
Oh, food, bed.
It's like, I can't pick. It's all of it.
Yeah.
Like with your bike?
Yeah, like I
Your
do
5-hour bike rides.
I do very long bicycle rides, and I do it. It's especially exciting and interesting to me when it's 105 degrees here in Texas, and it's like me fighting the elements, right?
Mm.
And it's got that kind of intensity of just being capable in my body, and knowing that I have that resource to generate that much energy, and to and so on. And then of course I do the self-pres thing of, I've got this pouch on the handlebars that I put those frozen blue ice things, that you put in like a little freezers or whatever, and I put 4 ice cold waters, so it's 105 degrees, and then I stop every once in a while, or just while I'm still going, dip into an ice cold water when it's 105 degrees. So that's another self-prezi satisfaction thing, right?
And you do your peanut butter and banana
Peanut butter and banana for 10 years every morning.
But so what's that you so first of all, the specificity of like a little like like is big self-pres, or just indicative of the instinct, but also what you're bringing up, that I think maybe people listening, if anybody listens to this, is that's easily overlooked in self-pres, is that physical, robust, like challenging oneself, like passionate about like doing physical feats and stuff. Like most like sexual, one of the things that has needed to be improved in the sexual instinct description is that sexual is not just a generic intensity instinct or excitation. And that a lot of like people that do a lot of extreme physical stuff, and athletes and all that, are usually self-pres dominant.
Yeah. Like I'm contemplating through hiking the Appalachian Trail in the next year or two, which is 2,200 miles, by the way.
Jesus.
And that's
Yeah.
like when I think about it, I'm like, yes, like
Yeah.
I
Don't
pumped.
die.
And in the
Oh, but that's
in
the-
the online world, self-pres is often depicted as it's almost like phobic, right?
Yeah, like they
it's like
don't want to go outside. or
yeah,
something
like
that.
it's super self-protective
Mhm.
rather than competent and
Getting off on paying the bills or some shit.
yeah, exactly, that
Even
stuff too.
self-preservation people hate, but they do it because they have to. Whereas a self-preservation blind person will probably just ignore it.
Do you
Right.
know how often I look at my credit card account and just pay like $5 on it just for funsies?
Wow.
Oh God.
Oh, that's painful
don't.
actually for me.
What?
Yeah. Please don't go into
Did
that.
you just say?
I
Oh man.
just today.
This call is over.
yeah. Let's stop.
I cashed in on my rewards points, and I was like, "Ah, yes, $8 done."
Wow.
Yeah. We might
Yeah,
need
I'm
to,
obviously sexual dominant, guys.
yeah. We
Sexual
might need to
four.
rethink this relationship.
Oh man.
What's another perverse self-pres thing?
For me, there's a lot of touch stuff.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that's partly 9, and it might even be somewhat, maybe more indulgent with self-pres sexual as opposed to Nancy, your self-pres social. I don't know.
Mhm.
But yeah, just sensual touch. Fabrics. I mean, since I was a child, I would touch clothes. I mean, touching the clothes when I was even a
All
child
of them in
was
the store.
as important. Like if I liked something, I needed to feel whether it felt good on my hand,
Mm-hmm.
right, and stuff like that. And I was always attracted to luxurious fabrics, not because of the cost, but there were usually just a finer touch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me and my partner, who is also self-pres, we will go through a store and he'll be like, "Oh my God, feel how soft this is," and we'll just stand there and be like, "Oh,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is so nice."
There it is.
Like we have a moment over how soft
Yes.
something is. It's hilarious.
Sexual types are side-eyeing both of you.
What's wrong with these people?
Like,
You
ugh.
insane people.
Gloria has she's sexual dominant, but she has a much stronger self-pres than I do.
Yeah.
And she often, I don't know how sincere it is, but she often wonders if I'm sexual social, which I don't think so at all.
Right.
But she also, like, she loves to save, and she like feels that like a dopamine rush when she gets a deal. And I mean, part of it, I think she's a very sensate person. But yeah, like fabrics and soft things and creams, she's all like, she gets a thing from. Much more than I do.
Trying to think of how my self-pres shows up. One thing I really like about 9s is they're really lazy and like to just stay home and just veg out in bed. And it's like I have like split personality in terms of I can be really assertive and just be like around a lot of people. I can seem like a really big personality, or I can be like a 9 at home and just
Mhm.
veg out on the couch and not leave the house for days and just like have my food. It's kind of like just I don't have to do anything. I don't have to see anyone. I can just be here in this room, and it's great. Like that sense of I'm just completely isolated from everyone and everything. In my bed or looking up Enneagram stuff or whatever it is.
Fiving out. That sounds like fiving out to me.
Yeah, definitely. Like
You like went to your 5 space. You're like, yes.
yeah, just like completely isolated. I can look out the window. There's people walking around, but I don't have to talk to anybody. It's great.
I need a lot of alone time, or I get sick and I get overwhelmed like really easily. Like I'm super withdrawn, but when I'm by myself, I don't really veg out really. Like, I mean, maybe I spend too much time on the internet, but like, I don't have that feeling of like I never like just chill. Like, I'm always doing something, like painting or reading something, and there's always or like working on something, and it's interesting. I don't know if it's like a wing thing or it's not being a body type or something, but even my vegging is not very veggie.
I guess what I mean when I say veg is that for me as a A-Wing 7, I mean like I'm not moving because I'm obviously online, like chatting and doing whatever else on my computer. But I think there's a lot of I put a lot of pressure on myself to be doing things constantly, which means like making things happen. So when I say vegging out, it's like I'm not actually making anything happen. I'm just here on my computer reading or researching, but it's still busyness, but it's just happening mentally or conceptually, but I'm not actually like actually moving my body. I think I beat myself up a lot for just being a pretty lazy person in that respect.
Yeah, a lot of the 8s in my life like get up super early in the morning just so that they can like read for like 2 hours, and they'll
Oh,
just
wow.
sit there in like complete stillness and just read, and that's their time, and you don't fuck with that time. But then the second they're done, they're like, ready to attack the world. And
Yeah.
I've just always found that interesting about the 8s in my life. I'm like, you guys have that precious stillness, which is so bizarre to me because it's not at any other time in your life.
Oh, like Trump's personal time?
Executive
Is it?
Executive
Yeah,
time.
executive time. Yeah.
That sounds dirty. Yeah.
Probably is.
Oh God.
Yeah, I grew up. My dad's an 8, and so I an 8-wing 9 as well. And so just he was very like loud when he wanted to be like a very loud person. But there's 4 of us, 4 kids, but he always had like his time, like away from everyone, and you dare not, don't even think about bothering him. Nobody could talk to him. Like he was doing his reading and his writing or whatever. He had his like own little corner desk and things like that. So it's just kind of funny to see how 8s can really like cocoon away from everyone. They like, just have to have that.
Mhm. I hate to be the self-pres social here, but I am very tired.
Yep. We're
It's been
past
over
an hour.
Yeah.
I'm so enjoying the flow of this right now, but I might fall asleep. So
All right. I think we've got enough for episode.
Yeah, this is good.
I'm gonna prioritize the flow, and I think we should keep going.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, bye.
And the energy.
I'm gonna prioritize sleep. So
Nancy, I hope you have the most restorative, restful, deepest sleep.
oh, thank you.
As
That
if
was-
you were
that's wonderful.
bathing in a big cup of warm green tea.
With
I was gonna
lavender. Can we have lavender in it too?
I was gonna say
Oh, yeah.
milk, but I guess.
Oh no, not milk. Milk is like you get out and you're gonna smell. Like that's gonna be weird, dude.
Yeah, I think I just
You're so particular. My God.
introduced a lot of.
Vividness.
I like the image more. It was kind of a mess.
Well,
That was
yeah.
definitely.
No,
myself
no,
playing
no, no.
into it.
And a bunch of
Obviously
white
not
stuff all over
self-pres.
her. Yeah.
Yeah, that was much more of a sexual image there for sure.
If I'm gonna bathe in white stuff, sure as shit ain't gonna be milk. That should be the opener for this. just play that.
The leading.
And
That'll be the title.
three guys here. So
Yeah.